What would you do if the weight of your entire future, and the future of your unborn child, depended on a single man's decision? Imagine standing in a crowded courtroom, your heart racing, your hands trembling as you cradle your stomach, silently praying that mercy will triumph over punishment. Friends, this is exactly the moment that unfolded when a pregnant woman stood before Judge Frank Caprio, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please, Your Honor. I beg you." The room went silent. The shuffle of papers stopped. Even the steady hum of the air felt louder than the breaths being held across the benches. All eyes turned toward her and then toward the man behind the bench, the man known not just for his rulings but for his heart. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching longer than anyone expected. What had brought her here, to this fragile and desperate moment? And what would he decide? This wasn't just another traffic violation. This wasn't just another case. This was a test of compassion, of humanity, of how far the law could bend when life itself was pleading for understanding. The woman's plea wasn't only about herself, it was about the tiny heartbeat inside her, the life she carried, the future she desperately wanted to protect. Could mercy exist inside the rigid lines of justice? Or would the law stand cold and unyielding? As the seconds ticked on, you could almost feel the questions rising in the minds of everyone present. Would he punish her? Would he forgive her? And more importantly, why had she risked everything to end up here, pleading in front of the world? Judge Caprio finally spoke, but not with the quick firmness he was known for. His words began slowly, carefully, as though he himself was weighing the deepest responsibility of his career. The tension gripped every person in that courtroom, and soon, it would grip the world watching this moment unfold. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just leave an audience in tears, it left millions questioning what true justice really means. Judge Frank Caprio is not just another name in the legal world. For decades, his courtroom has been a place where justice and humanity meet face to face. Known across the country for his unique balance of compassion and fairness, he has become more than just a judge. He has become a symbol of hope for those who walk into his courtroom with their heads bowed and their hearts heavy. People don't just come to face the law, they come to face a man who believes that every story deserves to be heard. His courtroom is unlike most. While the rules of justice remain strict, the atmosphere carries a warmth that surprises first-time visitors. There's laughter at times, there's empathy often, and yet, when necessary, there's firmness that reminds everyone that the law is still the law. The wooden benches, the quiet hum of anticipation, and the respectful hush when cases are called, all of it feels less like a cold machine of bureaucracy and more like a community gathering where truth and understanding are valued. And on this day, those benches were filled with people who had no idea they were about to witness something unforgettable. Her name was Elena. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, her face pale and her hands never leaving the curve of her stomach. Every step she had taken to reach that bench felt heavier than the last. The quiet courage she carried with her was overshadowed by a deep vulnerability that even strangers in the audience could feel. Elena was pregnant, alone, and visibly exhausted, not just from the weight of carrying a child, but from the weight of life itself pressing down on her shoulders. Her story, though not fully known yet, was written in the dark circles under her eyes and the careful way she spoke. She was not a criminal in the way most people imagine. She was not hardened by violence or arrogance. She was, instead, the reflection of thousands of unseen struggles happening behind closed doors every day: poverty, abandonment, impossible choices. Elena's journey to this courtroom had not been simple. Friends, picture this: a young woman with limited resources trying to piece her life together, while carrying the responsibility of another life inside her. What mistake could she have made that brought her here, facing not just the law, but the gaze of hundreds of strangers? The charge against her, though seemingly ordinary to the system, carried extraordinary consequences for her fragile situation. A fine, perhaps even jail time, could shatter the fragile stability she was barely holding onto. For Elena, this was not about paying a ticket. This was about survival. It was about whether she would walk out of that courtroom with a chance to provide for her child, or whether she would sink further into the quicksand of hopelessness. And yet, despite the fear in her eyes, there was also something else. A spark. A plea not just for herself, but for the innocent life within her. She wasn't just begging the court to see her as a case file. She wanted them to see her as a mother, a woman standing at the edge of despair, asking for one thing: mercy. Judge Caprio studied her carefully. Over the years, he had heard thousands of excuses, pleas, and explanations. Some were genuine, others were rehearsed. But this was different. There was an undeniable sincerity in the way her voice cracked, in the way her hands clutched her stomach, as though shielding her child from the harshness of the world. And as the audience shifted in their seats, you could sense the questions rising in their minds as well. What had she done? Could her unborn child change the course of judgment? Was this going to be one of those moments where compassion would outweigh the iron fist of the law? The stage was set. Elena's life, her future, and the future of her child hung in the balance. And Judge Caprio, with his steady gaze and calm presence, was about to show the world whether the law could bend for the sake of humanity. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was so fragile that the first words nearly dissolved into silence. "Your Honor," she began, her tone trembling, "I never wanted to be here. I never thought my life would come to this." The courtroom leaned forward. It was as if the weight of her story had already begun to press against every heart in the room. She explained how just a few years earlier her life had seemed ordinary. She had a job at a small diner, balancing long shifts with dreams of saving enough to attend nursing school. Her laughter, she said, used to come easily, and her circle of friends filled the empty spaces in her life. But life, as it so often does, shifted in ways she never expected. Her mother, the only family she had left, grew sick. Hospital bills piled up faster than Elena's meager paycheck could handle. Every hour she worked was swallowed by medical expenses, rent, and basic necessities. And then came the devastating day when her mother passed, leaving Elena with not only grief, but with debts she could never repay. "After she was gone," Elena whispered, her eyes brimming with tears, "I felt like the ground had vanished beneath me. I didn't just lose her, I lost the part of me that believed I was strong enough to keep going." Her loneliness grew heavier. Friends she once relied on drifted away, unable to carry the burden of her pain. Nights turned into battles against anxiety, mornings into reminders of everything she had lost. And then, just when she thought she couldn't carry any more, she discovered she was pregnant. The father of her child, she revealed with a trembling breath, had abandoned her the moment he heard the news. Promises of support evaporated into cold silence, leaving her to face not only her future, but the future of her baby, alone. Friends, pause and imagine yourself in that moment. A life growing inside you, the world outside crumbling around you, and no one to lean on. What would you have done? Could you have found the strength to push forward, or would the weight have crushed you too? Elena tried to fight. She took on extra shifts at work, walked miles to save on transportation, and lived off the cheapest meals she could find. But the demands of pregnancy slowed her down, drained her energy, and left her body weak. She fell behind on bills, behind on rent, and eventually she fell behind the law. The violation that had brought her to this courtroom might have seemed small on paper, a traffic citation, unpaid fines stacking up over months. But in her world, each fine was another nail in the coffin of her hope. Every dollar she couldn't pay was a reminder that society had little room for mercy when you were drowning. "I wasn't trying to ignore the law," she said, clutching her stomach. "I was just trying to survive. I chose between food and fines, between rent and penalties, between caring for myself and caring for my child. And I know the choices I made led me here. But Your Honor, what else could I do?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. There was no anger in her voice, no defiance. Only exhaustion, only the quiet plea of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The audience sat in silence, some wiping tears, others struggling with their own thoughts. Was she guilty of negligence, or guilty of being trapped by life's cruelties? Could a law written on paper truly capture the desperation written across her face? Judge Caprio listened intently, his eyes fixed on Elena. He had heard thousands of stories in his career, yet something about this one pierced deeper. Perhaps it was the sight of her hands, instinctively resting on her unborn child, as if shielding that tiny life from the coldness of the world. Or perhaps it was the way her honesty stripped away every defense, leaving only truth. Her story wasn't over, and neither was the tension in that room. Because the question still remained, would her past struggles be enough to sway the law in her favor? Or would the system remain unmoved, blind to the tears that now fell freely down her cheeks? The moment Elena's voice faded, the silence in the room was broken by the prosecutor rising from his chair. His tone was measured, professional, but there was no mistaking the gravity in his words. "Your Honor," he began, "while we can sympathize with the defendant's circumstances, the facts remain. She has accumulated multiple unpaid fines. These are not isolated incidents, but repeated violations of the law. If every citizen ignored their obligations, our system would collapse. The law must be respected." His words sliced through the atmosphere like a cold blade. He wasn't cruel, he was simply doing his job, presenting the reality that courts must weigh every day. Yet for those listening, the contrast between Elena's desperation and the prosecutor's logic felt unbearable. The prosecutor continued, listing the amounts owed, the deadlines missed, the notices ignored. The possibility of jail time was mentioned, his voice steady, unwavering. To him this was procedure. To Elena it was devastation. Each number, each date, each possibility struck her like a hammer against fragile glass. Elena's shoulders trembled. She lowered her head and placed both hands protectively over her stomach. The gesture was instinctive, primal, a mother shielding her child even in the face of judgment. And in that instant, her plea became more than words. It became visible, undeniable. "Your Honor," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "If I could pay, I would. I've tried. I've done everything I can. But I'm not just asking for myself. I'm asking for him, for her, for this child. Please." The room grew heavy with emotion. Spectators shifted in their seats, torn between understanding the necessity of law and feeling the raw humanity of the moment. Some avoided looking at her, afraid their own tears might betray them. Others fixed their eyes on Judge Caprio, waiting, desperate to see whether compassion could coexist with justice. The clash was stark. On one side, the black and white lines of the law, on the other, the messy, complicated truth of human struggle. And at the center of it all sat Judge Caprio, silent, his hands folded before him, his eyes locked on Elena. Friends, imagine being in his position. The law was clear. The penalties were written. Yet here was a woman, vulnerable and pregnant, asking for mercy. What would you have done? Would you uphold the strict letter of the law, or would you dare to bend it for the sake of compassion? The tension in that room could be felt in every heartbeat. Elena's breathing quickened as if every inhale might be her last before judgment. The prosecutor stood firm, waiting. The audience held its collective breath. Judge Caprio finally leaned forward. His chair creaked softly, a sound that echoed louder than words. He studied Elena's face, her tears, the way she shielded her stomach. He turned briefly to the prosecutor, then back again as though weighing two worlds in his mind. "Elena," he said softly, "do you understand what these charges mean? Do you understand what could happen if I uphold the law as written?" Her eyes lifted to his, wide with fear but also determination. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking. "I understand. But I'm begging you, please. I can face whatever comes, but I can't let my baby suffer for my mistakes." Her words shattered what little emotional distance remained. The courtroom was no longer simply a stage for legal procedure. It had become a place where every soul present wrestled with the same haunting question. Was this justice? The prosecutor shifted uneasily, perhaps sensing the emotional tide. The law was his anchor, yet even he could not escape the sight of a mother's plea. The suspense was unbearable. Would Judge Caprio hold firm to the law? Would he find a way to extend mercy? Or would he attempt to balance both, risking criticism from either side? The answer had not yet come, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just a case. It was a battle between the heart and the law. And soon the verdict would reveal which would triumph. Just when it seemed that Elena's voice had reached its final plea, she inhaled deeply and spoke words that no one in the courtroom expected. Her eyes lowered, her hands still cradling her stomach, and for a moment she seemed almost afraid to continue. "There's something I haven't told anyone," she whispered. The room stiffened, every ear straining to hear. Even Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, sensing that a truth was about to surface. Her next words poured out like a confession she had carried in silence for far too long. "When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't just broke. I was sick. Doctors told me I had complications. They warned me that carrying this baby would be difficult, maybe even dangerous for me. They advised me to end the pregnancy, but I couldn't. I couldn't take away a life that was already fighting to exist." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few people placed their hands over their mouths, others exchanged stunned glances. Elena's voice shook, but her eyes, filled with tears, held a strange strength. "I made a choice," she continued. "I chose to risk myself. I chose to believe that maybe this child could have the life I never had. And that meant sacrificing everything else. I stopped treatments I couldn't afford. I stopped paying the bills. I stopped living for me and started living for the chance that this little one might make it into the world." The weight of her words pressed against every corner of the room. This wasn't just a story of financial hardship or neglect of fines. This was the story of a woman who had willingly given up her own health, her own stability, because the instinct to protect her unborn child was stronger than the instinct to protect herself. Judge Caprio's eyes softened. For a long moment he said nothing. His hands folded on the bench, his gaze fixed on Elena as though he were seeing not just a defendant, but a mother whose love had already been tested in the harshest of ways. "Elena," he finally asked, his voice lower now, almost paternal, "you're telling me that you put your child's life ahead of your own health? That you knowingly took on these risks?" She nodded, her tears falling freely. "Yes, Your Honor. I couldn't let go. Even if it means I struggle every single day, even if it means I end up here. I couldn't give up on my baby." Friends, imagine sitting there in that courtroom hearing those words. Could you have looked at her and seen only fines, only violations, only paperwork? Or would you have seen what everyone else was beginning to see, a woman who was already a mother in every sense, long before her child took its first breath? The audience was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't just mean listening but feeling. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, suddenly less certain in his stance. And Judge Caprio, though still bound by duty, looked visibly moved, as if the walls of law around him were being tested by the sheer force of human compassion. The revelation changed everything. Elena was no longer just a defendant. She was a mother sacrificing herself for life. But would that be enough? Could even this painful secret sway the scales of justice? The question loomed over everyone, unanswered, as the weight of her confession settled like stone. The air inside the courtroom grew so heavy it felt as if even breathing was an effort. Elena's last words echoed in the silence. "I couldn't give up on my baby." She pressed her hands tighter against her stomach, her body trembling, and then, unable to hold it back any longer, she broke down completely. Her sobs weren't quiet, polite weeping. They were the raw, uncontrollable cries of someone who had carried too much for too long. Each tear that fell onto the polished wooden floor seemed to carry years of exhaustion, loneliness, and sacrifice. Her knees buckled slightly, and she clung to the podium for support, as though the very weight of her truth was pulling her to the ground. The audience, frozen in place, seemed to forget that they were spectators. Some shifted uncomfortably, their own eyes wet with tears. Others leaned forward, their hands clasped as though silently praying for her. For a moment there was no law, no court, no procedure. There was only humanity, all eyes locked on a mother pleading not for freedom, but for the chance to bring life into the world. Judge Caprio sat perfectly still. His silence was deafening. Normally quick to interject, to lighten the atmosphere with humor or to cut through excuses with sharp questions, he now sat with his lips pressed tightly together, his gaze unwavering. The pause stretched longer than anyone had ever seen in his courtroom. Friends, picture it. A judge known across the world for his humanity, staring down at a woman who had laid her soul bare before him. What thoughts ran through his mind in that moment? Was he weighing the cold clarity of the law against the warm pull of compassion? Was he hearing the prosecutor's voice in one ear and Elena's sobs in the other? The camera of storytelling would linger here, on Elena's face streaked with tears. On the prosecutor, shifting uneasily, perhaps questioning whether the law could ever feel fair in a moment like this. On the audience, eyes wide, chests tight, waiting. Every second was a cliffhanger, every breath a question. Would he punish her? Would he forgive her? Would mercy outweigh the structure he had sworn to uphold? Elena raised her eyes through the blur of her tears, searching his face for even the faintest sign of hope. Her lips quivered as though she wanted to speak again but couldn't. The strength she had summoned for her confession had drained away, leaving her exposed and fragile. Judge Caprio inhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. His hand brushed across his chin, a gesture that revealed both his weariness and his deliberation. It was clear he felt the full weight of this decision, heavier than any statute book, heavier than any legal code. The entire courtroom leaned forward as one, caught between the possibility of heartbreak and the chance of redemption. The suspense was unbearable. And then, Judge Caprio finally opened his mouth to speak. The silence was finally broken by Judge Caprio's voice, calm, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. "Elena," he began, "the law is designed to keep order, to ensure fairness, and to remind us all of our responsibilities as citizens. By every measure you have violated that law. The fines are real. The consequences are real. And under ordinary circumstances, this court would have no choice but to enforce them." The words struck like thunder, and Elena lowered her eyes, bracing herself for the weight of punishment. But then Judge Caprio paused, leaning forward, his voice softening. "Yet, life is not ordinary, is it? Circumstances are not always simple. And justice is not simply about punishment. Sometimes justice must also be about mercy." The audience stirred. For the first time, tears glistened openly in the judge's eyes. He gestured gently toward Elena. "You are not standing here as a criminal with no regard for the law. You are standing here as a mother, a woman who has endured hardship and sacrifice most people cannot imagine. You've made mistakes, yes, but those mistakes came from survival, not from neglect of duty or contempt for the law. And in this courtroom, I cannot ignore the humanity that stands before me. Elena's breath caught, her lips parting in disbelief. Therefore, Caprio declared, his voice strong now, I am dismissing the fines against you. You will not carry this weight into the birth of your child. Instead, I want you to carry hope. I want you to focus on bringing that baby safely into this world. That, Elena, is your sentence, to be the best mother you can be. The words rippled across the courtroom like a wave. Gasps gave way to sniffles, and soon, tears ran freely across the faces of strangers who had never met Elena until this moment. Even the prosecutor lowered his eyes, moved by a verdict that transcended law itself. Elena collapsed into grateful sobs, whispering thank you again and again, her hands trembling over her stomach as though shielding her baby with newfound hope. And Judge Caprio, with quiet dignity, added one final line, may this child one day know that mercy can change the world. Sometimes, friends, the greatest lessons don't come from statutes or textbooks. They come from moments like this, where the weight of mercy is heavier than the weight of punishment. Judge Caprio's decision that day was more than a ruling. It was a reminder that justice isn't only about enforcing rules, it's about seeing the human being behind the mistakes. Elena's tears weren't just the tears of relief. They were the tears of a mother who had carried the unbearable alone and was finally told she didn't have to carry it anymore. Her gratitude filled that courtroom in a way no fine or sentence ever could. And for everyone who watched, both inside those walls and later across the world, the message was clear. Compassion has the power to heal wounds that punishment could never reach. What would you have done if you had been in Judge Caprio's chair? Would you have enforced the law strictly, or would you have allowed mercy to guide your hand? These are the questions that remind us of the fragile line between right and kind, between justice and humanity. Friends, tell us in the comments below, do you believe he made the right choice? Your voice matters here because stories like Elena's are not just stories about the law, they're stories about all of us, about the kind of world we want to live in. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that mercy still exists in this world. And if you believe more people should see moments like this, give it a like. Not for the algorithm, but because each click helps spread a little more compassion into a world that often feels too cold. And remember this, justice can change lives, but mercy can save them. Yet, as emotional as this case was, it was not the last time Judge Caprio would face such a choice. Because soon after, another case came before him. One even harder, one where mercy and justice collided in ways no one expected. And what he said then, left the courtroom in shock once again. Stay with us because that story is next.